New York's classic rock, Q1043.
Good morning to Ron Chaluisan. He's the executive director of the Newark Trust for Education, and the hot issue all this week, I mean, it's been brewing all this month, but all this week was Governor Murphy finally listening to the parents and the teachers and the school employees and saying, okay, we can start our classrooms, our education in the fall with remote education, although certain things have to be proven in order to do that. But at least it looks like we're going to have a good chance that any district that is not comfortable with in-classroom education can do it remotely. Are you happy with the way this has been handled, Ron Chaluisan?
I certainly am happy that there are choices available and that the local districts can take into account all of the issues that they need to take into account. I do know that parents certainly are putting safety at the top of their list and processes and procedures to make sure that any safety protocols are actually adhered to. We hear that constantly. And so giving districts time to actually flesh those processes and procedures out, think about accountability metrics for making sure that they're actually put into place and allowing the buildings to be readied for having children in and plans to be finalized, I think makes sense. I think the virtual learning piece, while it is definitely an important component to learning, has its own set of complexities that absolutely need to be addressed. And certainly I believe that resources need to be made available for families to be able to access online learning in a way that's going to be effective for their children.
Okay, now we can step back and look at how it worked since March. So how has remote learning worked in New Jersey since March, and how can we make it work better?
Great. And I think I definitely want to think about this as a continuum. I don't see it as a black and white issue in the sense that there were some situations for some students in which transferring to an online environment worked for very specific reasons. And there were, on the other end of that spectrum, there were some families that didn't even have the option of accessing the online environment because of the digital divide. So I think that there are points along that continuum that are really important to talk to. And as you say, look at what happened over the last 4 months, learn from it, plan, and make it more effective moving forward.
Well, what have you seen? What have you actually seen?
Sure. So I like to always start with the positive. So in some instances, there were children who, through the online environment, had access to what are called adaptive programs. We have adaptive programs in math and adaptive programs in reading. And what that does is that the actual technology supports understanding where the kid is in their practice, right? Where are you in your learning of mathematical concepts? And it gives you examples at your level and then starts to push you as you master that further and further up. Those types of programs, those types of adaptive programs are positives. I think that's one piece. I think there were other places where for some students, there were distractions, or there are distractions, right? And we are constantly trying to think about how do you help minimize distractions in a classroom setting. And for some of the students, they found that actually by having specific times and routines on the computer where they had assignments they needed to complete, they could stay focused on that for the right developmental amount of time, right? If you have a 5-year-old, it's different than a 14-year-old, that worked for them. So kind of thinking about how do we integrate those lessons into our regular learning process moving forward, I think is important. Now, if I flip to the other side, we are constantly looking at, it was as high as about 30% at one point in time of homes that did not have the appropriate devices and internet access.
Right 30%, so basically a third?
Early on, it was a combination of either not having the number of computers that were necessary, right? Because if you have 3 children in a school, thinking that they were going to share that computer was just unrealistic. And the piece that was more, nuanced and complex was the internet connections that are needed, right? It was a whole new world of using technology. And so if you think about our own experiences, right, you and I, suddenly medicine and jobs and school and social interactions, right? There were all of these uses for technology. And what happened was that in a home of five, say 3 children, 2 adults, or 2 children and 1 adult, 3, there were spaces between when the technology was being used. Everybody wasn't using the technology at the same time. And so the connections were okay. But once you start having multiple users trying to access video conference and multitask doing assignments, the bandwidth necessary increases. And so that is additional costs. And in some places, it's actually additional connections. And so though early on, when no one anticipated, when it was an overnight change, we suddenly saw those pieces very clearly. School systems, I think, did an amazing job of rallying around getting devices to students. So they got them the Chromebooks, they got them the tablets, but the connection piece was a little bit more complex and difficult to address, many of which did it through hotspots, but even that, while good, wasn't great.
So what can be done moving forward with that?
Yeah, so this is, I think that this is when we talk about, when we talk about a system level change, and I think the governor has started to talk about this, right? What does New Jersey need to do to ensure that families, households, have the appropriate level of connectivity? And so that is about bringing providers together, right? The Verizons of the world, the Optimums of the world, bringing those providers together, and also bringing the system together in order to understand what the level of need is, what is the level of resourcing necessary, and then how do we get the right level of resourcing to do this. I think this is a longer term project that needs to be thought of. Many cities have engaged in something along those lines. I know that in Newark, for example, downtown Newark was wired, right? It actually has a very good reputation for the fiber optics that came into play. They have a really solid system. So how do we expand that from downtown into the wards in Newark? But across the state, there have definitely been some efforts to this. I think it is a citywide level with the state supporting that. That's a conversation that needs to be had. In the meantime, I do think that allocating, having resources available that can be allocated to ensuring hotspots is one strategy. I think another strategy is thinking about facilities that exist in communities that have enough space so that kids and families can adhere to social distancing and masking, but that those buildings then have a public utility, right? If we could help to wire those buildings, right? Maybe 3 or 4 buildings within a community that have the adequate space, places maybe like Boys and Girls Clubs, places like YMCAs, that then we could have community spaces. Obviously, the library is another really important player here. We could have community spaces that could adhere and expand the usable space for families and children to access internet. I think that's another strategy. And then obviously the school buildings themselves, making sure that every school building is wired at the level it's necessary for the type of connectivity that we need.
But if parents and teachers don't feel safe going to schools right now, how could they feel safe going to the Boys and Girls Clubs? It's still the physical building.
Yeah, but I do think that I think one of the elements, one of the variables in the safety conversation is density, right? And schools by definition, right, certainly are working. Most schools, I believe that the typical school size is somewhere around 600 students. So you're working with 600 students and at least 100 adults. So you have about 700 people altogether. And what I'm I guess advocating for is that if we're only thinking about the school building as the singular space where learning can happen, then you're definitionally putting all of those people together. Are there ways of creating working partnerships that expand the square footage, right? So that you can actually then spread people over. Here's an example. Some communities have community colleges in them, right? 2-year colleges. Many of those community colleges the student population that goes to them starts going to them around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon because they're working adults. It's a very different type of population. So those sites are sitting unused. Now, it's complicated, right? It's not an easy solution. It's not snap your fingers, open the door, because you have to think about security and cleaning and all of those. So there are some incremental costs. But at the end of the day, if we could expand the square footage available to our communities, make sure that those places are actually wired to the level necessary, and adhere to the safety precautions of masking and and physical distancing, we then have it's a different ballgame, right? We have more flexibility. We can think differently about how to maybe move ahead.
Go ahead. I had another question, but go ahead.
Because I was thinking back on your virtual learning part of the conversation. One thing that's really interesting in virtual learning, going back to this notion of a typical school of 600 students and 100 adults, I was a school principal for 10 years, and one of the things that I needed to do was schedule and program my building, right? And the limiting factor on that was the number of classrooms that I have available to me. So I could never have more classes in session than the number of classrooms I had available to me in the building. The virtual world actually blows that apart, right? So I could have all of my teachers teaching at the same time. And when that happens, just because of the way that schools are staffed, you actually decrease the number of students that any one teacher is responsible for. So if we had a big mental shift and really thought about teachers as facilitators of learning and not so much the content experts at this moment in time, if we were willing to say, we are going to assign one teacher to 10 students to be their facilitator of learning, right? Their one room schoolhouse teacher, the one who's going to help them think about what questions they need to ask and guide them to the right resource. And we could actually have classes, we could have all of our teachers teaching all of our kids in that ratio for a shorter amount of time, so that the kids are actually getting the one-to-one support, they are having the interaction with the teacher, they're actually getting the kind of ongoing moment-to-moment guidance in their learning. So I'm just trying to say, are there ways of breaking down our way of thinking about school right now that opens up possibilities that are different than what we're used to?
Okay, so what it seems that would be necessary in this situation, and again, the situation is fluid because we shouldn't be in this situation forever, but we don't know how long we're going to be in this situation. So my question is, do you know of any efforts? It would seem that the governor should be working with teachers and principals and parents in looking at this big picture that you say needs to be looked at and various ways to solve this. I mean, it's a big, big umbrella.
It is giant, and we live in a state that has many districts, and the reality, I think you started by stating, right, that the local conditions are really important. And that is really true, right? We have some smaller communities that are more isolated where the incidence of COVID is minimal, right? And so that solution in that community and what's possible in that community is going to be very, very different than a community that has a high rate of infection. And so I do think the flexibility is important. What you just said, though, I think is the key. I have a strong belief. I have a deep-rooted 35-year in this business belief that if you truly engage your parents and teachers in a problem-solving methodology, right? Let's come together. Let's absolutely take the expertise of parents and teachers together. Let's blow it up. Let's just say we're starting with a clean canvas, and let's brainstorm on what is possible with the resources that we have available in this community. You will come up with quite a number of interesting solutions. The question is, can the state give enough flexibility, right, to allow the local communities to come up with that? And in my experience, I think that it's always been, the equation in essence has been innovation for outcomes, right? If you agree to a certain set of outcomes, then you're given the space to innovate. And so what I hear is tremendously important, and I think we're pretty much in agreement on these things, right? One, students need to be together in some form as they're developing that allows for social, albeit physical, distanced interactions, but some interactions. Being cooped up at home or feeling like they can't leave their home is not a positive situation. That's one. Two, kids need to be engaged in ongoing learning. They have to be engaged in ongoing learning that is supported and guided. They can't do it on their own. It is unrealistic to think that I'm going to give a kid a textbook or 20 worksheets and they're just going to learn it on their own, right? So they have to be guided with experts who are our teachers who know how to do that. I think three, that parents need kids to be in places, right, where they are safe and secure, because parents also have to work, right? We have a lot of parents who do not have the option to not work, right? And so we have to just acknowledge that and make sure that's a front burner conversation and not try to hide that in the weeds. Right now, school is the solution to that problem. My question is, does school have to be the solution to that problem? I'm not convinced it has to be. I think that there are other options that we might pursue.
So what would those options be? And by the way, just in case you're just tuning in, I'm speaking with Ron Chaluisan. He's the executive director of the Newark Trust for Education, and we're talking about basically our new education system in the pandemic, because everything is blown up and it looks like it may be continuing to go that way. But what do we do? What are some of your ideas? Because people do have to go back to work.
That's right. And so, this again is a place where I feel I kind of go way out and try to look at the whole system, right? And for me, we live in a set of communities, or my experience. I'll speak from my experience. My experience in working in a set of communities where childcare has been tremendously underfunded. Right? Parents are constantly looking to figure out. We live in an economy where parents are doing multiple jobs. They have a lot of responsibilities just to make ends meet. They are super engaged in the sense that they are out there doing what they need to do to provide the resources for their children to move ahead. That is not often an easy task. And what happens is that they put together these networks for childcare that are patched together. There's not a systemic support that is under that system that is a strong set of supports. And so I think we should be looking at that. And again, I go back to my previous statement where I was thinking about, what have you started from scratch? Because some of that conversation is built on the assumption that kids are in school from 8 to 3, right? So our entire childcare infrastructure has now a faulty assumption. And so we have to rethink the entire system by changing that assumption. And so if we don't start with kids are in school from 8 to 3, and we say, what would a childcare system have to look like in order to accommodate the types of learning that now we are forced into making sure are effective, it's a different conversation. It is not something that's going to happen overnight, but I do believe that we are at an inflection point where what we have assumed up to date will no longer be the same assumptions. And therefore, I think that different groups need to be working on these different issues with the long game in mind, right? There should be a group that's dealing with it right now. What can we do the second? And that's where some of these additional community organizations might play a role. But long term, we have to figure out a solution where their childcare infrastructure is stronger.
Ron Chaluisan, we have run out of time. If people want to continue this conversation, this is a conversation that we need to be having right now. How do they get in touch with the Newark Trust for Education to join this conversation?
I'm glad you said that. We actually are running a pretty open-ended survey right now, which can be accessed on our website, which is www.newarktrust.org. You'll have tomorrow, Monday, to finish up. We're closing it down at midnight on Monday. So either today or tomorrow, actually going on, it's called Thought Exchange. You could click into there and put all of your thoughts and actually see the thoughts of other residents around the ideas that they have, the concerns they have, and the questions that they have.
Okay, one more time for the web address.
Or www.newark, Newark, trust, trust.org. Nothing in between, Newark Trust.
Okay, that's just awesome. I'm so glad we had this chat. Ron Chaluisan, a lot of food for thought here. And guys, I will be seeing you. Well, you'll be hearing me. I'll be seeing Jim virtually tomorrow morning on the Jim Kerr Rock and Roll Morning Show, Q104.3.
New York's classic rock, Q1043.